Welcome, everybody. We are going to kick off our next roadway safety worker protection webinar series featuring Alex Kelly, who's the CEO of Salt and Company. This one is titled Effective Incident Response. Just so you know that this session is being recorded. All of your microphones have been muted. There is a Q&A option on your Zoom navigation bar. Please use that at any time to ask questions. Alex's presentation will be about 35 minutes, and so there will be time for Q&A at the end of her presentation. We also will have a survey that will pop up at the end of today's webinar. Your feedback is very important, so please take a moment to complete that survey before you log off at the end of the webinar today. So the Roadway Worker Protection Council is new to ATSA. They just met and had their official committee meeting or council meeting this past convention in Tampa. The council will meet next in person at the ATSA mid-year, which is in Rhode Island, August 22 through 25. And they have many subcommittees that are meeting between each convention and mid-year to do the work of their committees. And some of that work has led to the need for these various webinars that we will be offering you. So again, I'm pleased to have Alex Kelly with us today. Alex is, as I said, the CEO of Salt and Company. It's a strategy firm that has helped transportation organizations such as Uber and ATS Traffic create compelling conversations around road safety. Alex has led road safety program initiatives across Canada for National Injury Organization Parachute. She has a Master's of Science in Public Health through the University of London and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Joint Program, as well as a Bachelor's of Arts in Health and International Development from Queen's University. So Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. And let me just share my screen for all of you. All right, so everyone should be able to see my screen, no problem, and make sure we're all in the right place, like Pamela alluded to. We're here today to talk about effective incident response. And I just wanted to kick things off with a bit of a warning. So I acknowledge that today's topic and conversation that may result, it may touch on traumatic events, and it will, such as workplace injuries and fatalities. And I know for a number of members from ATSA, this may be something that you've actually lived through yourself, and it may be triggering. And so I'd like to do what my colleague in this world, Cal Beyer, did at ATSA's convention, and I'm totally stealing this from him, but I think it's a really important reminder to please do what you can to protect your mental health today and your emotional health. This presentation will be made available. Like Pamela mentioned, we're recording it, so you can always come back to it. Please don't feel that you have to sit through it today, particularly if today is just not your day. Please just take care of yourself. So that's just my little guidepost before we jump into things. So to give you a bit of an overview of what we're talking about today, I'm going to be leaning a lot on my injury prevention background and public health. I'm really talking about the different type of incidents and why this is important for us. Incident response is something that unfortunately has to be part of our DNA as organizations, particularly ones that are operating in high risk areas that are prone to a lot of risk. And we need to really think critically about why we need these plans, because if we think critically about it, we'll make sure that we include all of the different elements that we need rather than just doing it to check a box. So let's start by defining what incidents are and why and how they affect our workplace. And then also talking about identifying those risks and as they relate to the typical elements of a plan. And we'll walk through some examples that, in particular, the Federal Highway Association has put together. And then we'll talk about leveling it up a little bit. So how do we make sure that we're not just focusing on the scene, but we're focusing on the entirety of your organization and the community and the partners that you interact with, to really make sure that we're being holistic in our treatment of an incident response, knowing that it really is a ripple effect when we look at catastrophic or traumatic incidents in the workplace. And then finally, knitting it all together, I've got a program called the Safety Blind Spot Blueprint, and this is just really a way to help you identify where the blind spots are in some of your safety planning so that you're not caught in a lurch in the middle of an incident. Like Pamela mentioned, I've been working in this space for a really long time. My background is public health, like she mentioned. And, you know, really that just means that I'm coming at this from probably a very different direction or avenue than a lot of you on the phone. And so I really hope to bring that perspective to what we're here talking about today so that we can really benefit from a multifaceted experience, because I think really, you know, not to sound too corny, but we're really strengthened by the network of roads or highways or experience that we have here at ATSA. And so I'm really proud to bring that different perspective. And in addition to working with some fantastic transportation clients, I've also worked with a number of healthcare providers looking at injury prevention as well as risk mitigation. So I love this quote, and I'm going to start off our presentation here today with it. The only thing tougher than planning for a disaster is explaining why you didn't. And Bob Fields, this actually came out of some of the research that I was doing for today's presentation. Bob Fields, manager of emergency services out of Santa Clara County in California. And this was actually taken from an article many moons ago that was reflecting on a very devastating earthquake that hit that area in 1989 that really devastated, like I said, devastated the area. And I think that his quote, probably said in passing to the journalist that he was chatting with, is really a tough reminder of why this work is so important, and also acknowledges that the actual act of putting together these types of plans can be very difficult, and it can be emotionally draining in and of itself. And the fact is, we're planning for something we don't want ever to happen. But the nature of doing it is so important, because it means that when push comes to shove, or when injury or incident affects your community, you know what to do, and it happens relatively seamlessly. And I will acknowledge that some of the sources here today, I'm happy to share them. I do live in Canada, I'm also American. So they're coming from both sides of the border. So we are lending a little bit of international experience, I guess you could say, throughout this. But happy always to share any of the work that I've included here. So I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're starting out on this webinar journey here today, and talk about what an incident means when it comes to these traumatic situations that happen, and how we respond to them. And organizationally, we see a lot of different definitions of an incident. And similarly, we see a lot of different definitions if you're talking to perhaps an insurance company or an HR professional, or even somebody in the healthcare industry. So the first one, and I'd say the one that we're primarily concerned here today with, particularly given the nature of the Roadside Worker Protection Council, is when we're talking about the death or serious injury of one or more employees. And I will, you know, put a caveat to this one that, you know, injury can be its own really sort of span of different, or scope of different levels of severity. So, you know, we've got our minor, our major, and a catastrophic, but really today we're focusing on those serious injuries. So the major, the catastrophic, that are really going to change, you know, the direction of somebody's life. We can also really look at this from an organizational context when somebody is injured or killed who may be a client or a customer, maybe it's a subcontractor or a member of the public related to your organization's services. So maybe something happens on a job site, but it's a member of a public who is transiting through in their own personal vehicle. The other thing to be aware of when we're talking about incident response is that sometimes traumas come in through other channels or avenues of an employee's life. So when I speak about that, you know, maybe something they've had their own traumatic incident, maybe they were in a car crash outside of work, maybe there was a death in their family or something also that was equally devastating that's starting to impact and, you know, have that ripple effect within the organizational community. Obviously, as well, when we're talking about incident planning, there's also natural disasters that we may come up against. So things like an earthquake or a tornado, or something that may happen to your office building because of those natural disasters, or something else like a major fire. When we're looking at incidents and starting to plan for them, there's also this idea of a near miss, or as one of my colleagues on the council says, a good catch. So those things that almost led to a devastating incident. And those are really important as well to include in your planning, as well, in addition to including in your sort of overall review of daily operations, to really understand how we can learn from those near misses or the good catches, and include that in your culture of prevention. The next point that I wanted to talk about is a really interesting one, because if you were starting really from, you know, square one, trying to put together an incident response or to kind of anything within an organization, probably if you Googled it, one of the most common things that will come up in that initial Google search is relating to the loss of equipment or a security breach, specifically like a data breach, a hack, to your system. And I included that there just to talk about, you know, the interesting idea of, as a society, that when we're talking about incident response, we're seeing more and more information about our digital footprint rather than the human footprint. And so it's just, you know, also something to consider as an organization, but also just really an interesting point to bring up that maybe our priorities are a little bit out of whack when we think about how we're looking to mitigate risk and deal with issues. So all of that to say, we've got a lot of different incidents that can happen as part of an organization, and as a leader, as a manager, director, these are all things to consider. But for today, in the context of ATSA and the work that we do, we're really focused on transportation and roadside related incidents. So that's primarily what I'm going to be focusing on today. But know that when you're doing these types of plans for your entire organization, there's a lot of other things that you may want to include. And also the resources that I'm talking about here today, for example, like an employee assistance program, those can apply to a number of these other things too. So the first thing I wanted to chat about is preparing for an incident. And this comes directly from one of the sources. This is actually from the Canadian government, our federal government, and they pose these questions. If a tragedy or life-threatening event happened in your workplace, how would you respond? How would you protect your employees? How would you help them recover from the emotional trauma or deaths of coworkers or their injuries? How would you help your employees get back on track? And how would you take care of yourself? And these questions may seem, you know, like, why are we starting with this, Alex? How is this important? But when you really dig down into it, these questions can really form the basis or the foundation of your organization's effective incident response. Because you start to play out these scenarios, ideally proactively in a safe space, and start to think about, what do you need? What tools are required to respond effectively? How can we be there for our employees? And how do we ensure that we can get our organization back on the rails with respect to our mental, our emotional well-being, and then farther down the road, productivity. And then also, if you are the manager who's in charge of dealing with these plans, or maybe you're part of the safety committee, how do you ensure that you're also nurturing your own personal well-being and emotional well-being so that you yourself are coming through these incidents okay? So why is all of this important? You know, I know I can't see all of your lovely faces, but I know that we're all working in this transportation and roadside world. And so I don't need to tell anybody that our roadside workers are some of the most vulnerable, and oftentimes some of the most vulnerable are some of the newest and youngest employees that we've got. So I think of flaggers, obviously, quite immediately. And when we look at the data, and this is where the data starts to kind of get a little bit lumped together, but when we look at workplace injuries, and so roadside and construction workers fall into these categories, they're most at risk of getting injured by falls, being struck by an object, electrocution, and being caught in or between equipment. And these are all US based, but I can tell you right now that it's not a different story in the Great White North where I am right now, or in some of our other sister countries as well. These are very common, and the more generalized categories for these, like being struck by an object or being caught in or between, this really comes down to how it's coded in the hospital. And so it is a little bit more generalized, but being caught in or between equipment could also be in or between vehicles. In all fatal highway construction related incidents, we tend to see pedestrian vehicle interactions coming through most often, and they account for around half of all incidents in some of the most recently available data. And so, when we say pedestrians, I'm not just talking about people who are crossing the road or walking their dog, but when we also think about an unprotected roadside worker, they are also can be included in these counts as well. So, really disproportionately, our most vulnerable are the ones who are getting injured and killed most often. And when we look at the further causes specifically related to workplace injuries on the roadside, these are caused by, again, some of the mechanics that you would expect. So forward moving vehicle, vehicle backing up, or a vehicle hitting another vehicle in a work zone, and then it strikes their victim. So again, there's a lot of different vectors at play here. Certainly you've got the public who's traveling alongside the roadside where we're having work done. But then also you can have that with some of the big machinery, trucks and like that are there supporting the work too. So what are we doing about this? And, again, I know that we all know that there's a tremendous amount of regulations and legislation that's out there to support safety. I put it up here just as an illustrative concept, but, we've certainly got almost every letter of the alphabet up here working to ensure that we've got those safety standards that are set out to protect our workers so that we can get people from point A to B and home again safely every single day. So signage, standards development, training, that's all happening. Obviously advocacy efforts to raise awareness like ATSA. And the bottom line is that workers, they can be prepared and we can do everything we can to protect them, but there's other motorists and road workers out there. So it's a dynamic, constantly changing environment that we need to account for. And sometimes that's when the incident happens. So my next quote here is, prior preparation prevents poor performance. A bit of a tongue twister, and I'm sure if you've seen this quote before, there's some more colorful versions of it as well. But this one really strikes home because it's all about the power of prevention and preparation and being proactive. So lots of P's in this game, but really it speaks to the need to really think through these things before you're in the middle of a chaotic environment that's emotionally taxing and stressful. And so that's where we really need to start to think about how we can tackle these things head on before they're ever even an issue. So why is planning a response really important for this sort of space? So like I mentioned previously, really doing effective incident response planning, it allows you to create that safe container where you can decide what your best course of action is without the emotional and mental strain of an incident. When we're in a stressful environment, our brains are just trying to survive. So it's that fight or flight method, or mechanism rather. And we're really just trying to ensure that our basic needs are met. And so we're not thinking critically. Physiologically, if you think about any time you've ever been stressed, maybe your fingers get a little bit cold, maybe your heart's beating a little bit faster, maybe you're not thinking about, complex calculus or algebra problems because your brain is really just focusing on survival. You can't think about what you're going to make for dinner. You can't think about all the things on your to-do list. You're just thinking, what's the next right decision? And similarly, to kind of be in the middle of an incident and try to deal with well, how can I make sure that my staff are okay? And how are we communicating the message? And what's the HR protocol that we need for this sort of thing? And who do I call at the EAP? And do I have a crisis counselor on speed dial? All of that is a lot to figure out. And all of that in your brain is not helpful if maybe you're the one who gets injured, or you're off, or you're on holiday that day. So figuring out a response before allows you to think about it calmly with all of your resources at hand. You can create a complete plan that factors in everything, and you can document your steps one at a time of what you're going to do. And that allows you to build a framework so you can understand, okay, well, after step 1, we did step 2 and we did step 3. And if you ever have to use that plan and you debrief it and you say, well, we did step 1 and 2, but really we should have had a 2.5 in there because we were kind of lost before we got to step 3. So for example, we told our staff what was going on. We made the EAP and the crisis counselors available. And then, we really just focused on getting back to work. Well, maybe the debrief is saying that you needed a little bit more space and time for your employees to grieve or to talk, and that another better step to include in there would have been, contacting all of your contracts and deadlines and extending them to allow people that space and time to grieve. That's kind of a very quick and blunt example, but really the importance of planning allows you to have something to come back to and learn from those incidents. And I will say in this sort of scenario, and I said it off the top here today, that this is really hard work, and it deals with a reality that no one wants to consider. And like I mentioned, I used to work in the injury prevention world, and unfortunately I dealt with a lot of the bad stuff that happened too, and talking to people after some of the worst days of their life. And nobody ever plans for something bad to happen. You don't get in the car and on your way to work in the morning and plan for a car crash. You don't plan to slip and fall and break your ankle. Nobody's planning for that. And as human beings, denial is a very sophisticated response to fear. We're afraid and we don't want to deal with it, so we deny that it could happen to us. So taking that first step to actually go through this planning of a response in an informed and educated and calm way, that really ensures that you're going through it in the appropriate fashion. And that's something you should be really proud of as an organization. Sometimes I know things get so busy in a corporate setting, and it's hard to focus on something that's not going to give you a direct return on investment, or you may never have to use. However, when push comes to shove and that does need to come off the shelf or out of the binder, you'll be so grateful that you have it. So how do we do this? So, here's a quick rundown of how to prepare, and I'll get into some more tactical details towards the end of the presentation. But first thing is most organizations have a safety committee. And so this is a diverse cross-section of your company that allows a number of different perspectives to really create a strong and responsive plan. And that's where you start to figure out what your plan looks like. And you want to make sure that your plan and the people that are building it really represent all of the different elements. And again, we'll talk about some of those in a little bit, but some examples here are communication. So, who is going to be a spokesperson, but also who can be in charge of cascading messages throughout the organization, as well as to partners in the media and things like that. Who do you need from a technical side to advise on, the scene, appropriateness, the legal side of it, the regulations? Are we following everything appropriately? And then how are you going to train staff appropriately and also cascade those messages out to them so that everybody understands that culture of safety and embodies it and knows what to do, what their job is, should something happen on scene, in the office, or somewhere in between. The important thing here too is that this is not a one and done kind of project. This is a plan that has to be revisited regularly. It needs updates. And so you may have regulatory changes. Some of your staff may transition in or out of the organization into different positions. So you'll need to ensure that, you're not pulling out the plan to use it one day, only to find out that Bob is no longer at the organization. So you've lost your technical guidance. And then finally, one of the best things that can happen, and I say that knowing that, again, this is probably not the activity that a lot of people want to do, but one of the fringe benefits of it is sometimes when you go through a plan and what you would want to do if something did happen, sometimes it can actually highlight a risk that already exists that you can mitigate immediately through your plan development. So for example, maybe you realize through the development of your plan that, if something does happen roadside, that you would need a certain level of management to be on scene, to be directing law enforcement and emergency services. But you realize that due to the staffing structure, that person or that role doesn't actually go to site every day or isn't always immediately accessible. So how can you start to build that into their day-to-day work plan, mitigating the risk of not having somebody on site that was identified through your effective incident response development. So this is from the Federal Highway Administration. And again, I have this if anybody would like it. It's from a great document that they've developed that I would highly recommend. And this is really a coordinated incident response that they recommend if you do have an incident on the side of the road or in transportation environments. And I'm not going to try and recreate the wheel on this one, no pun intended, because I do believe that local and state level, as well as national or federal agencies, know what to do and make excellent recommendations and have passed a lot of laws about how this all works and what happens when we're in these sorts of incidents. And I think that this is a fantastic visualization of a plan. Also, it gives you a very clear-cut idea of who is doing what and how best to use the resources. And so this is really, what's happening in the moment, and that is what you need. So we start from the actual incident recurring, moving through first aid, managing traffic, then moving into containing and stabilizing materials, removing vehicles. I'm just picking some in and out here. But getting to the point where, the pavement is free and clear, that, resuming of typical construction operations or traveler or traffic operations. So this has a clear start and end. And oftentimes when we're looking at an active lane of traffic or a roadway, we need to ensure that we can get people moving again, because we can have secondary and tertiary incidents that occur by having some sort of collision or hazardous material or other road closures impacting our lanes of traffic. So this, like I said, has a very clear start and end. What doesn't necessarily have a clear end is what happens afterwards within your organization. And so that's where I'm really going to provide a little bit more information about that, just so we can kind of talk about the holistic idea that I was talking about off the top. So like I mentioned in that diagram previously, so there are those typical elements, and I'd say that everybody here on the phone today is very familiar with them. So, how do we investigate an incident appropriately? How do we work with our enforcement to conduct that, whether it's your Transportation Safety Board here in Canada or, different levels of law enforcement locally, state, wherever it happens. Obviously, you're going to have some different key players in there. And development of a report and recommendations for prevention. Like that's pretty much your standard. And it complies with those regulatory and legal requirements. And it also does give that opportunity to learn from an incident. So likening it to a plane crash, for example, there's that black box where we can learn from what happened and create those updates to our protocols to prevent it in the future. Similarly, when we're doing an accident or a collision, which we'll talk about accident in a moment, but when we're doing a collision investigation, that's also giving us that opportunity to learn, not from a black box, for example, but from, really breaking down what happened. And I put that asterisk on the whole idea of an accident because you'll see in a lot of the incident response frameworks and documents out there, accident typically refers to an unavoidable act of fate. And really in the injury prevention world, and I'm sure you've come across this, we really like to focus on describing what happened. So a collision, somebody skidded out, somebody was distracted, really starting to explain what happened so we can learn effectively from it. So that's what typically happens within a plan. However, that's where I really want to talk about an organization. We're so much more complex than just what happened on site, because people leave site and they go back to the office, they go to the next job site, they go home. So there's other areas to attend to: our wellness of our employees, communications, the continuity of our work. So it brings me to my third quote. Where do I start? And that's kind of you as the webinar participant right now. You're probably thinking, we've gone through everything. What happens after I leave the site? How do I really manage this appropriately? So that's where I really want to focus on staying calm so you can manage everything from the scene to your staff. We know that it can be stressful and traumatic and overwhelming. We talked about the physiology of that previously. And so that's where being proactive and focusing on all of these things beforehand is important. So it's focusing on the what do I, do, say, need, and debrief. And so I'll break that down for everybody here. And I've actually developed a bit of an infographic here that I've got available if anybody wants it after the fact, to really kind of organize your thoughts and situate you appropriately. So first off, what do I do? So this is really focusing on that diagram I showed you previously. But what are we doing on immediately after the incident, on the scene, making sure that we're complying with authorities, regulations, and any clients, customers, subcontractors to secure the scene. So that's your, initial focus to keep things safe and contained and prevent additional collisions or incidents from happening. Obviously, what's happening at your scene will vary from industry to project to position or even location or jurisdiction. So again, it's really important to work closely with your partners, with enforcement, with jurisdictional regulators to ensure that you're prepared, and legally you need to be prepared appropriately and know what to do, but know that it changes across jurisdictions. And for some of the folks on the call who maybe work across state lines or subcontract throughout the country, this is also really important to know, especially if you're sending employees to different locations, to ensure that they're appropriately prepared should anything happen if it's different in different jurisdictions. And then finally, in terms of the do, know who to call and what role everyone must take. Research shows that people, typically will stay a lot calmer than maybe they show in the movies, or you think you might be if you were faced with a traumatic incident or a catastrophe. Oftentimes people are very calm, but this is where training really is important, because when we're calm but stressed, sometimes it's easy to forget things. But if you've been trained and you have that muscle memory to know, I need to call my boss, I need to call the state, I need to call the investigator, I need to call the police, it just becomes very easy to kind of slip into a default. It's just like when we were kids and we were taught, always look both ways before you cross the street, or call 911 in this case of emergency, or if you hear a fire alarm, get down on the floor, look for the exit. All of these things we're training people to do time and time again, so that when you need to use them, it's just, again, that muscle memory. And again, I wanted to bring up this diagram just one more time, because I really do think that these sort of initial immediate responses are very well articulated by our partners across different federal, state and local jurisdictions. And so really understanding them, and even, finding this guide or similar ones to ensure that people are following the appropriate steps. Maybe it's printing it out, including it in your safety protocols or your safety committee meetings, and having it as part of your training for new folks who join your team. And then say. So this is a really interesting one, because not only has something happened, but now you have to communicate about it. And depending on your role within an organization, the type of organization, or the type of community or the incident that happened, this will be very, very different. And so one of the best things that you can do, and I always advise my clients to do this, is to assign spokespeople, again, far before anything ever happens, because people need to get really comfortable with that role of being potentially on camera, being a figurehead for the organization, giving quotes, not without a lot of support, obviously, within the organization, but people need to really get used to that role. And sometimes you need to offer that sort of communication, so media training, again, so people feel that they are well equipped and set up for success to deliver some really difficult news. The other thing that you need to do is try to develop some key messages and strategies for if something does happen. So obviously your key messages, and when I say these are kind of, bullet point notes about what's happened, what your organization's response is, all of these different things. These key messages will change depending on the incident and what happened. And so you'll have to have a communication team that's ready to come to the table with these sorts of key messages. However, there's pretty standard kind of boilerplate ones that you can work with that can help to build out that key message so that you've already got a template. So that might be, we're working with local authorities, we're supporting this investigation, even something as simple as, currently right now we're asking for privacy and we'll be in touch with the media when we're ready. These sorts of key messages, it may seem very easy to kind of just spell out right now. But again, when there's 1,000 things going on and your brain is already in that stressful state, it may not come as naturally. So just having it down as part of your protocol is really a best kind of practice. And then also your strategies. And we get into this in the subsequent points, is starting to talk about, who do we connect with first and how do we do that? And do you have a do you have a company intranet that you use? Is there a way to send like an e-blast or a text blast to everybody who's on site? Do you kind of filter things through different departments? What is your strategy to send out messaging and how does it change depending on what the messaging is? Then you need to think about how you're communicating internally within your organization about the incident and the next steps and support. And recognizing that different incidents may require different mechanisms of communication. So, if something happened off-site, how you communicate that may be very different in terms of communicating to your head office versus the people who are actually on-site dealing with what's happening. If you've got a different type of incident, like a natural disaster or, an active shooter scene within your head office, you may need to communicate with people immediately about what they can do to protect their own safety and, how to kind of evacuate the building versus something that doesn't impact headquarters or head office, how to, instruct people to remain at the scene and stay calm. So all of these different messages and all of these different scenarios are really important to walk through so you know what to say and how to ask your staff to react accordingly. The next one is, how are you going to connect with somebody who's injured because of a workplace incident? Or how are you going to connect with their family if unfortunately they've been killed in the line of work? And so obviously you need to figure out when you're going to reach out and also what you're going to communicate. So are there HR resources? Is there counseling or grief options that are available to family? And what is kind of the next step for them? So obviously if you've got an injured staff member, communicating with them and supporting them and everything that they need and making those resources available to them. And then eventually longer term, maybe weeks or months, starting to connect with them about return to work plans. That's a very different conversation than what will happen with, family members who've lost a loved one and, what happens next with them and in memorial of their loved ones. Then, once you've kind of really looked after your internal community, it's looking at the external facing elements of your organization. And sometimes these happen in different orders, and that's fine. But again, you want to ensure that you're prepared for anything that may happen. So that's where it's really important to walk through the what would we do if scenarios in your proactive planning. So what's going to go on your website? How do you communicate through social media? What partners, subcontractors, clients, what do they need to know about what's happened within your organization. And sometimes these messages are, devastatingly difficult to put together because you're talking about the loss of a very important person within your organization. Sometimes it's about complying with the local regulatory body. Sometimes it's, you have to limit what you say because of an investigation. But knowing, again, what you're doing ahead of time will help you effectively put them out at the right time, should the time come. And then finally, only when ready, addressing the media. And so this is one thing that I share with clients all the time. There's never a rush to address the media, and you need time to collect your thoughts. So asking for privacy, deferring to the authorities where it's appropriate, and then prepare for a larger statement when you're ready. Because sometimes, we speak quickly because there's a camera in front of us, or we feel like the urgency of the news channel. We kind of adopt it as our own and feel like we need to respond quickly to get the story straight. But then sometimes we may let things slip that may be important to the investigation to be released by the enforcement agencies, or we may say something about the victim unintentionally and it may hurt the family, or people may not know about it that need to know about it privately before it's out on the media. So again, having some safeguards there around the media to direct what happens, just to avoid that sort of knee-jerk response when they do call for comment, because they will. And then need. This is where we start to look at the critical resources that our staff need to get through this effectively and to feel like they're supported. So the number one here is the access to employee assistance programs. And I know they're kind of vary across the board, and we've got some great experts out there in the ATSA universe that can walk people through them quite effectively. But there's EAPs and government programs that can help people with, they need somebody to talk to, or they need sort of help figuring out what their next steps are because they've either witnessed or been affected by a traumatic incident. And the important thing here to note as an employer is you can make people aware of EAPs. You can never force them to go. It has to be voluntary. And so, making it available, you're doing great work and ensuring people know about it. But no, at the end of the day, it is their choice to pursue these EAPs and other similar programs. One of the other things that you need to organize ahead of time is looking at our human resources. So what do we have that supports, benefits for employees and their families? So those policies and protocols like disability, return to work, or, shifting towards looking at bereavement plans as well. Having contact details for mental health and crisis response practitioners is really important. This can, ensure that you've got people on call or in the office or on site as needed to help walk people through the next steps. Community resources, again, there's a lot out there: mental health associations, distress lines, crisis intervention, bereaved family services, child and family services, local unions. These are all great phone numbers, contacts, meetings to have ahead of time so that you know who to call and when. And it's really important to make these available, but also, checking in with your staff. And if there is something that's really impacting them, making sure that if they have to go for an interview, for example, with enforcement, there's somebody there to meet them afterwards. Or if they're going home, making sure that there's somebody there to meet them when they get home, so that people, again, feel supported and that they're not alone. And then also finally, figuring out a protocol and resources for post-incident support for the entire staff. Everybody grieves differently, and you'll never know what it'll look like because it's not a linear journey. And you need to allow people space and time to really process what's happened. And sometimes, people will want to talk about it. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll not be able to focus on work, or they'll go into like a hyper productivity mode. It might be days, weeks, or months before it hits them. And so, I wish I could tell you that there's a guideline of time based on the incident and the trauma level, but it's not that seamless. And so the important thing here is to just allow for flexibility. So that may mean that deadlines and contracts, they need to be extended or delayed. You know, you may have to sort of look at your staff capacity on a day-by-day basis. And sometimes, unfortunately, when we have these incidents and somebody is seriously injured and can't return to work, or they've been killed in the workplace or due to an incident, you do need to fill that position. And something that, you know, all of the best practice guidelines state is that this is a really delicate process to work through the actual staffing changes or bringing in a new person. And so this is something, again, that may take time. That position may stay open for a while, or the whole team may need to be restructured just to allow for, again, time, space, and respect for the process of what's happened. Knowing that people are really feeling quite sensitive at that time, and that may persist for a while. And it may persist every year on the anniversary of what happened, or, you know, through different seasons or milestones. Those things, you know, again, keeping an eye to them. And then finally, debriefing. So, you know, really this is important because we learn from the debrief. So there's sort of two, 3 times that we want to debrief. So there's the actual incident. So what actually happened? And this may be after the investigators come through, after there's tickets or citations that have come through. And that really helps you understand exactly what happened. And you may be able to commit that to a new policy or protocol immediately. The other thing that you want to debrief is those waves of your response too. So how did you communicate things? Was there any backlash in the media? How was your staff supported? Did they feel like they were supported? You know, did people use any of the resources? How was productivity? And I don't mean productivity to measure how well we're doing getting back to work, but more as a proxy for kind of, you know, sort of day-to-day normalcy. Like, where are we at? Do we feel like people are still working through this? Because again, it is a very delicate situation. And sometimes you have to look at those proxy measures to start to get an understanding of the things that we all find hard to verbalize. And then also debriefing return to work operations. So how is that going? Do we need to make any changes? Has this impacted our business in a way that we need to make some pretty serious permanent changes to either, you know, our return to work policies or how our organization currently exists? And so here, you know, I've got that note for key learnings that obviously informs your future policy, and you'll come back to your whole incident response plan just to make sure that it's still current and makes sense for you. And then the final note, if you're the one who's doing all of this planning and the development and the activation of an incident response, it's stressful. And so whoever's deploying that incident response needs to ensure that they're really taking care of themselves. And so this image here, it's the one we've all seen. You make sure you put on your own oxygen mask before you help others. So you really need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself too. And it may feel like in the moment, you're so busy, you couldn't possibly be bothered to, you know, go for a walk or eat a salad when a pizza sounds great because you want to collapse on the couch at the end of the day, or you just don't have time to eat. But you really need to practice those boundaries, separate yourself from work to, you know, give yourself a mental break. And also make sure that you're aware of the changes in your own habits. You're looking out for your staff, but you also need to look out for changes within yourself. And sometimes what's really helpful is if you've got somebody in management or who's also helping you activate these sorts of plans, it's also great to talk to them and see how they're doing, because sometimes we need community in crisis to ensure that we really feel supported too. And then finally, you know, make sure that you use those resources that are available to you as well. So if you really feel like this is having a lasting impact, you know, maybe that's when you activate your own EAP or talk to a doctor or counselor or other health professional, because really at the end of the day, you are part of the list of people that needs to be taken care of, even if you feel like you're handling it okay. So I know we're kind of at the top of our time here, but for anybody here who is really interested in kind of identifying some of these gaps. We do have a program. I'm not going to go into it very detailed here today, but if you do want to talk about sort of identifying some of these issues and making sure that you've got a really great blueprint for safety, you can always send me a note. But also here, I've got this infographic. It's obviously quite skinny because of the PowerPoint, but it's a full-size PDF. And I'm happy to send that to anybody here so that you at least have a bit of a structure for your incident response that is that holistic, comprehensive plan. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Pamela for, I think there's a chat or some questions at next steps. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Actually, we don't have any questions right now in the Q&A. So we'll go ahead and give it another minute or so and see if any pop up. And if not, I see that you have your email address there on your slide, so folks can reach out to you. Will we get a copy of your presentation?
Yeah, so I can make that available. I'll send it to Pamela, and then anybody can go through her, or, you know, you've got my email there too. I'm happy to shoot it to, you know, whatever email communication works, either Pamela or myself.
Great, great. And again, this session was recorded, so we will make it available, probably get posted to our website on Monday. And if you have any questions, again, you can reach out to Alex directly or reach out to myself. And thank you to Michael Nersessian, who has been on the line as well, in case we had any technical issues. But I'm going to go ahead and I don't see any questions. So thank you all again for joining us. Michael, did you have something?
Yeah, we actually did just have a question pop in.
Go ahead.
So the question was for you, Alex, that you had mentioned earlier in your program about having a point of contact that's on site regularly. The question is, what recommendations would you have for a company that can have as many as 20 plus sites in a day?
Yeah, so, you know, I think that when we have a point of contact, it's really important to ensure that every site has, you know, some sort of even brief hierarchy that, you know, if there is a need for enforcement to come on site or emergency services, that is the point person who's going to relay that and handle any sort of inquiries of that nature. So, you know, even if you've got 2 people on a site, who's going to be the first person for contact? And it's really important to designate that, even if it's not a formal organizational position like a manager or a director, but at least, you know, a site supervisor or a site lead, so that you know that that's the phone number to give out, that's the person they should be looking for. And then also training that point of contact on site so that they can triage any sort of questions that do come through and bring them back to management so that people understand that that's a really integral part of the safety and incident response process. And that, you know, even if an incident doesn't happen, it's important to bring back any near misses or good catches to ensure that people are well aware of what's happening and we can appropriately address that as a safety concern.
I don't see any other questions that have popped up in the Q&A. So Pamela, if you want to go ahead and close if there are no other questions. Thank you again, Alex.
Thank you all.
All right, well, thank you all again. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have a survey that will pop up. So please take 1 or 2 minutes to complete that survey. Your feedback is very important to us here at ATSA. So enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us.